When using the word conservative, different philosophical paradigms come to mind. Under this surprisingly large umbrella fall three distinct strands of conservative thought today: libertarians, social conservatives, and defense hawks. In the spirit of these three veins, American conservatives have, for the most part, stood for three broad propositions: that the domestic function of the government should be limited, that the moral precepts associated with the Judeo-Christian tradition should be upheld, and that American defense and military should be strong, and foreign policy should seek to advance the ideas of liberty. The coalition of ideas created during the 1950s that adhered to these principles began what became known as the conservative movement. Conservatism as a movement began when National Review magazine was founded in the mid-50s and molded primarily by two editors of the magazine, William F. Buckley and Frank Meyer. Bill Buckley was largely responsible for getting the ball rolling for the formation of the magazine, and if National Review had not been founded, there would likely have been no unifying intellectual force for the conservative movement in the 1960s and the 1970s. Buckley developed a strategy for this conservative venture with these three main objectives. He wanted to, at that time, keep the Republican Party, the chosen vehicle of conservatives, tilted towards the right, eliminate any and all extremists from the movement, flay and fleece the liberals at every opportunity, and push hard for a policy of victory over communism in the Cold War. These objectives could not be achieved, however, by only one of these three strands of conservative thought. Thus, the necessity of a coalition of the three was made evident in the articles and columns published by National Review. In the words of Dr. Donald J. Devine, quote, "As benefiting conservatism's modern view of common sense and tradition, the new doctrine was not planned, but grew from interactions of its creative but divided staff, which needed some common ground from which to publish a coherent enterprise," end quote. Frank Meyer, part of this team at National Review, dubbed this enterprise fusionism. Many conservatives today do not know the names Bill Buckley or Frank Meyer, yet through their propagation of conservative fusionism, they have arguably done more to shape the modern conservative movement than any other thinker. It is their philosophy of conservatism that was embraced and popularized by Barry Goldwater and by Ronald Reagan. Fusion is, in its simplest terms, using libertarian means to pursue and achieve traditional social conservative ends. In the 1950s, this formula manifested itself in conservative support of Western values and opposition to both communism and the welfare state. This came in the form of advocating Judeo-Christian morality, the family, patriotism, and support for means such as individual freedom, free markets, voluntary associations, and local governments. The conservative movement in its earliest phase had three key components. First was the commitment to ideas and principles. The people involved were philosophically grounded and had all read a common body of literature authored by men such as Hayek, Kirk, Richard Weaver, and Edmund Burke. Second, it was a grassroots movement that affected change from the ground up and not from the top down. Finally, good leaders arose who were committed to conservative principles and who guided and popularized the movement. Fusionism culminated with these leaders in the Goldwater campaign of 1964 and the Reagan presidency in the 1980s. But this all began with William F. Buckley and Frank Meyer. They attempted to show that what was traditionalism or social conservatism today and libertarianism are not only compatible, but both ideas are necessary in the conservative philosophy. In his writings, Meyer sought to recover the pattern of Western tradition, which he wrote held both freedom and virtue in balance and tension. Virtue was considered the highest end of man, but over time, freedom was seen both as a precondition to virtue and as man's political end. While libertarians and traditional social conservatives both rallied behind the common enemy of communism, Meyer argued that they should likewise rally around their common heritage. Through this philosophy is what became called fusionism. Meyer saw this as a revival of the founders' concerns, not a melding together of two separate traditions. The founders, he wrote, were concerned with both freedom and with virtue. And only after the French Revolution in 1789 were these principles divided. Classical liberals became too hostile to religion and to tradition, while classical conservatives defended authoritarianism. Meyer thought that both had part of the truth. Either side that pushed to the extreme were in error, and the libertarians and social conservatives of his day were merely emphasizing compatible prongs of conservatism. Meyer further maintained that both prongs were necessary for true conservatism to be effective and profitable. He wrote, "Truth withers when freedom dies, however righteous the authority that kills is, and free individualism, uninformed by moral value, rots at its core and soon brings about conditions that pave the way for surrender to tyranny." Meyer's influence in shaping the conservative movement cannot be understated. When he died, Buckley wrote in an obituary that Meyer was, quote, "the father of the fusionist movement in American conservatism that seeks to bring together in symbiotic harmony the classical laissez-faire of the 19th century liberal and the reverence for tradition of Edmund Burke, a fusion that has continually been described as defended by the founders and seen throughout the conservative tradition." Ronald Reagan, in his address to the 1981 Conservative Political Action Conference, spoke of the need for this robust fusionism in the conservative movement. And I quote, "Our goals complement each other. We're not cutting the budget simply for the sake of sounder financial management. This is only a first step toward returning power to the states and communities, only a first step toward reordering the relationship between citizen and government. We can make government again responsive to the people by cutting its size and scope and thereby ensuring that its legitimate functions are performed efficiently and justly. Because ours is a consistent philosophy of government, we can be very clear. We do not have a social agenda separate, a separate economic agenda, and a separate foreign agenda. We have one agenda. Just as surely as we seek to put our financial house in order and rebuild our nation's defenses, so too we seek to protect the unborn, to end the manipulation of school children by utopian planners, and permit the acknowledgement of a supreme being in our classrooms, just as we allow such acknowledgement in other public institutions." End quote. In the same speech, Reagan declared that this sort of country would be, and I quote again, "a place where a free and energetic people can work out their own destiny under God." End quote. Under the Reagan administration, these things did happen. Each branch of the conservative movement worked together to attempt to bring social conservative goals into being through libertarian means.